dealing
Which one's
with
Tweety?
service
we have 4
industries,
minutes.
natural gas companies, and they want to come, they want to call and ask questions. But, so who would be,
Just keep smiling. Bill, you look rather pensive, and I can understand. Worst of you. Second thoughts. You know what? They may return to third thoughts, or might revert to
Okay, I do. I have some of that in my personal life. I have a little plastic container that has stickers and fingernail file and needles and thread and pins and buttons. With Joe, I never.
Is it a year? I don't know, I just have, I sell it on.
yeah, I just never saw it.
I'm not, well, you may not like the way
You know
I
what? This is the last meeting of this decade.
There's going to be all that statutes on that.
Next one will be
Standards per se. I think it's resolved because they've already made the determination. What else?
when you're having fun.
I think we'll have some time.
Stop.
You should have been here Monday. Oh, you were here Monday, sorry. Yeah, I heard that was you were.
yep.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Well, Monday wasn't too much better, although they did. No, it's the performance of song, I think they made their points.
That's like internal use.
No, performance of some,
Matt does that for us.
I think they made their.
We have 30 seconds left.
I wasn't impressed with that.
I give up. I give up. I give up.
But he doesn't have. But God forgive him.
Right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is 1 p.m. on the 12th day of December. It just crossed my mind that this is our last meeting of this decade. Our next meeting will be in the year 2020. We have no minutes to read. We do have a little bit of change in the regular agenda. Item number 3 will become item number 1. Item number 1 will become item number 2. Item number 2 will become item number 4. And item number 4 will become item number 3.
Adds up to 5.
First thing on the agenda is the 11 items on the consent agenda. Would anybody like anything moved off of there? Are there any questions on the consent agenda?
Madam Acting Chair, I think I would like to remove item number 4. I have some questions that I'd like to explore.
Item number 4.
I believe that's docket number 19-0747.
Yes. Matter of the application of artesian water.
Otherwise, I would hereby move that the consent agenda be adopted as submitted and edited.
I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any, we're all here and we're all saying yes, all right. Do you want to address item number, consent agenda 4 before we start on the regular agenda?
It may be fairly straightforward. I might want to ask if staff member Josh Bowman, if he's here.
Yes, he
Bowman
just
here?
got here.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Mr. Bowman, welcome. On this item, I'm reading through the staff memo that indicates a maximum statutory 7.5% maximum allowed increase per year. And this shows an 8.78% increase. The DSIC rate is not based on any net additional plant, but rather reflects the removal of an over-collection adjustment. So it just seems to me an adjustment for over-collection should result in a refund or rebates to customers. In this case, it looks like the trend is in the opposite direction. So can you help me understand the logic?
Yes, so, in June, Artesian. Can you use the microphone very close so that people? Hello? Okay, so in June, of this year, Artesian filed a DSIC, and they went to the actual, I don't know if it was it the 8.7 in June?
So I can speak to it if it would help.
What?
Introduce yourself, please.
Scott Steffen for Artesian Water Company.
Thank you.
When we did our DSIC,
Into the mic.
when we did our DSIC filing for effective July 1st, 2018, we had hit the statutory cap of 7.5%. Part of the 2018 DSIC audit and review showed that we had a small overcollection of $20,000 approximately. So when we did our application effective July 1, we hit the statutory limit of 7.5, but then we reduced it for that $20,000 overcollection to refund it back to the customers, brought the rate down to 7.41%. So in our application right now, we're already at the statutory rate of 7.5. We were just removing that overcollection that was being refunded for the period of July 1st, 2018 through the end of this year. That's what happened.
So the
That would be our real rate today. If we recalculate, and we calculate our DSIC rate, if we weren't capped at the statutory rate of 7.5, we would be at 8.78 approximately.
and the credit brought you down.
Yes.
Okay. I think I understand, Madam Chair. I don't think I have any further questions, but I would hereby move that we adopt this item as accepted.
I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Thank you, Mr.
Motion
Bowman.
carried. Thank you. Do you need an order number here? All right, and now we will go to the amended regular agenda. As item 3 is number 1. Item 3 is, in the matter of the formal complaint of Richard Spinks doing business as Gigglebugs against Delmarva Power and Light regarding the determination of a tariff rate category filed November 8th. I think we have Jim Geddes for staff, Vicki Goodman for DPL. Is Mr. Spinks here, please? How about Mr. Wallace from Clean Energy? Gina's here, yeah. All right, let's start with Jim.
Good afternoon, Madam Acting Chairman. This order is one that is a consensual order, and as a result of some further modifications from the last time it was on your agenda, it was tabled. The parties met, basically modified the order to a form that I believe all parties support. So I would request on behalf of staff your favorable consideration of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Goodman?
We agree.
Okay. Gina?
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair and Commissioners. The DPA does support the proposed form of order. Thank you.
Any questions? Motion?
Move we approve proposed order number 9502.
Second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, number 1 becomes number 2. In the matter of the adoption of rules and procedures to implement the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standards Act as applied to retail electricity suppliers, PSC Regulation Docket Number 56. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair and Commissioners. This is proposed order number 9522, which memorializes the Commission's determination on the December 5th hearing regarding DENREC's letter request to, let me back up. It was on the agenda as consideration of action regarding DENREC's submission of calculations. DENREC, prior to the hearing, filed a letter request asking for a extension to May 31st. There were other submissions as well, written submissions from Mr. Myers and Mr. Stevenson from Caesar Rodney Institute. I should distinguish that. Mr. Myers individually, Mr. Stevenson from Caesar Rodney Institute. And there was also sworn testimony from Glenn Moore of Delmarva Power and unsworn testimony from Dale Davis of Delaware Solar Energy Coalition, and Mr. Nicholas DiNardo, who is a legislative aide to State Senator Harris McDowell. The Commission determined at that December 5th hearing to give an extension until January 15th. As stated in the letter, the Commission denies DENREC's December letter request, but second ordering paragraph states that the Commission directs DENREC to provide the calculations on or before January 15th, 2020. This order was circulated to all the interested parties and accurately memorializes Commission's December 5th deliberations and decision. And staff asked that the Commission look favorably upon order number 9522. Thank you.
And we do need to vote on this, correct?
Correct.
Any questions, Commissioners?
No questions, Madam Chair. I move that the Commission adopt order number 9522 as submitted.
And I second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, now we're on to number 3, which is the one that is written as number 4 on the agenda. The matter of the Delaware Public Service Commission's jurisdiction over electrical vehicle charging stations and service providers. Mr. Geddes' staff, Mr. McGonigal is, well, we've got a whole list of names, but let's start with Jim Geddes.
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair. This order basically concludes this docket by suggesting that the consensus of the people that participated in, of which there are many, decided that electric vehicles are not public utilities, nor are they electric service providers. And as a result, recommending to the Commission that you not regulate the electric vehicle charging stations at this particular time under the statute and under general considerations of public utility law. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Ivory, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair and Commissioners. I don't have anything to add, but we do want to thank the hearing examiner for his thoughtful and detailed findings and recommendations. He was presented with a lot of information which he, I think, synthesized very well in his proposed report, and we do thank him for the attention that he gave to this matter.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGonigal from DPNL.
Madam Acting Chair, members of the Commission, Tom McGonigal from Delmarva Power. Delmarva Power supports the proposed order, and we wanted to echo the comments from Ms. Iori in terms of the hearing examiner. This process was very efficient, thoughtful, and allowed for ample input from the parties. So we wanted to thank the hearing examiner for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stevenson.
Yes, I would echo Ms. Iori's comments and say this is one of the fastest dockets I've ever participated in. It was handled very efficiently, and I support the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick Bean from Tesla. Not here. Jamison Tweedy from Denrick.
Hello, Madam Acting Chairwoman. DENREC supports the hearing examiner's proposed report, and we echo all the comments that have been made about the speed and efficiency with which the docket was handled by the hearing examiner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brian Green or David Schatz from ChargePoint. Daniel McAllister, Kathy Harris, Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thank you. NRDC echoes the sentiments that have been expressed and supports the findings.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the commissioners? We have before us order number 9516.
Madam Chair, I have a few questions. So I think this group has done a great job. In fact, I'm very surprised that there's no controversy at the end of this long journey, but I'm very pleased at that as well. And I'm, for the most part, I do support the hearing examiner's report. It raises for me a couple of questions, and perhaps there's more activity or tasks that will take place after we have this vote to clarify a few of these things. But one question I have is, how will commission oversight of public utilities be affected if we decide to forbear regulation of utility-owned EV charging stations? Or have I misinterpreted the hearing examiner's findings?
Commissioner Gray, I don't believe it will be affected the way this order is crafted. It essentially excludes certain folks from the definition of public utilities, and public utilities will be regulated in the same way they are now. I would also point out there is another docket that came before the commission earlier this year. We call it EV1, but it's 17-1094, and that deals with these issues. And there's a working group that's part of that final order that will allow for the commission to be involved in these issues going forward with respect to Delmarva Power.
The only comment I would make is I don't think it's completely clear. Delmarva Power has shown interest in building infrastructure. As a regulated utility, can they, in fact, invest in infrastructure with investor funds that would not be regulated? I don't know that that particular issue has been addressed.
That kind of led to my question. Are we creating some form of interpretational conflict by not regulating utility-owned, well, not regulating charging stations?
Chairman Gray, I don't think it's that you have, by this order, that you will not be regulating utility-owned charging stations. I think that particular question has been left for another day. Should Delmarva come before you in the future with an application with respect to seeking approval of actions regarding charging stations?
Okay. So I just have two comments as a follow-up for the working group, if on the record that's appropriate. I think there should be a framework of procedures to ensure and maintain the safety and reliability of public and fleet charging operations. You know, even at gas stations, they have either the flame extinguishers or safety elements that take place. And I know that a number of these stations are going to be installed at third-party properties, but there should be at least some assurances that the safety of the consumer and the user of these facilities is somehow mindfully considered, and that there is an enforcement mechanism to ensure that that takes place. And I assume that the working group will bring any additional clarifications needed regarding EV auto dealerships, for example, because I think we regulate car dealerships. And just to make sure that we've considered that facet of our oversight in the consideration of deployment of charging stations. No further questions or comments?
We have before us order number 9516.
I move approval of proposed order number 9516.
Second.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We are now down to item number 4, which was item number 2. In the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for an increase in natural gas-based rates. Docket number 17-0978. We should have Mr. Skaggs from Delmarva, Mr. Geddes staff, Ms. Iori, and Lindsay Orr. Mr. Skaggs, would you like to start?
Thank you. Just 1 second to get all my stuff situated. This is, of course, a rather long tail on the gas and electric rate cases that were filed. This particular issue, I think, has been under dispute for a year or more. I think the reason for that is it is a very important dispute, and the decision of the commission here is very important and likely to set a precedent that we would urge the commissioners to think very carefully about, because it could bear on something that has not been made completely clear in the commission's previous decisions or in court decisions, and that is how the commission will evaluate and determine whether extraordinary expenses are recovered, and if and when they are recoverable. Delmarva certainly understands the efforts and zeal of staff and DPA to reduce electric rates in Delaware. It's their job. They do it aggressively and passionately. We must disagree with staff and DPA today in at least 3 areas in this docket. First is their efforts to make inroads against the business judgment rule by seeking to have extraordinary expenses become effectively impossible to recover unless they qualify as rate-based items. Second, we have to disagree with their efforts to use hindsight to attack rational and good faith business decisions simply because those decisions later encountered unforeseen problems. That's those types of attacks and those kinds of reasons for disqualifying an expense for recovery is not a proper legal analysis in Delaware or anywhere else. Thirdly, we cannot agree with their efforts at attacking the hearing examiner's report. We believe that his report is well-reasoned and well-supported in the law. We will say, as an aside, that we don't agree that using or referring to the judicial officers, the hearing examiner's conduct in other cases about going outside the record, et cetera, would be something that should be considered in this case. We submit, actually, that the hearing examiner demonstrated here an intellectual honesty to give the commissioners an accurate and well-reasoned report. When he evaluated the law and logic supporting each side's position, he saw only one result, Delmarva's position, that followed the law and hung together as sound policy. And he provided that report to you, and we commend it to you. So, with respect to the hearing examiner's report, we have the first objection of staff and DPA is that it did not comply, in their view, with the remand order from this commission. And we understand the language, and of course we were here in the remand order that the hearing examiner erred by finding the battery replacement costs were ordinary, and therefore the application of the business judgment rule was inappropriate. That's right there in remand order, paragraph 3. But there is a compelling reason why, and reasons why the hearing examiner ended up back at the business judgment rule. The argument at the last hearing was dominated by, in fact, I would say essentially exclusively revolved around whether those replacement labor costs for the IMU batteries were ordinary or extraordinary, those terms. When they announcing their votes, the commissioners spoke only about their views on why the expenses were extraordinary, not as to what the application of what the standard, what standard should be, or whether the business judgment rule would apply thereafter. If you look at the commission hearing, Commissioner Gray said, "I would have to agree with the chair that the fact that there were reasons to replace the batteries after approximately 5 years, if I read it correctly, would be an abnormal, unordinary occurrence, which might lead me also to conclude the expenses were extraordinary." Commissioner Drexler expressed her reasons why she agreed that it was extraordinary expense, did not mention the standard of review or whether it should be business judgment or not. Commissioner Conaway said, and I would agree with my fellow commissioners, that because the life of these batteries were to be 15 to 20 years and things went wrong much earlier, that this was an extraordinary expense. End of Madam Acting Chair comments. And so, although there was that put in, and we think the assumption that the business judgment rule would not apply came from the hearing examiner's original report, which said these should be allowed under the business judgment rule, these labor costs, because they're ordinary. And based on that, I don't think it really came up at the hearing whether the inverse would be true. That is, if they were extraordinary, whether the business judgment rule could or would apply. Although that is, without doubt, what ended up in the order. So, we also, by the way, at Delmarva, were, and I think we expressed at the hearing, we weren't exactly sure which would apply. It did go in the order, but here we get to the bottom line. When we went back on remand, and there was a full investigation and deliberative process on what the standard should be, it led sort of unveeringly back to the business judgment rule. If you take a deep and hard look at the law, which we did, we discovered that the assumption in the remand order that a different standard would apply was simply wrong. The law of Delaware, based on the relevant decisions and all the law we found in neighboring states, supported only one conclusion. The same standard should and does apply to extraordinary expenses as it does to ordinary expenses. There's no support for using a different standard. We identified no other standard to even try to apply. So we gave the hearing examiner what we found in the law, our reasoning on what makes regulatory policy sense here, and he agreed with us. It is unusual, but not unheard of by any means, for a lower court or tribunal to analyze an issue on remand and to tell the higher court or tribunal that I cannot follow your remand, it's at least as written, because I tried, I looked at the law, I looked at the facts like you told me to do, and I found that if I did follow your remand order to the letter, it would lead to a misapplication of the law or a misstatement of the law. And that's what the hearing examiner here did, and he had the intellectual honesty to do. So we're here to say we would hope that this commission surely would be not so wed to the assumptions ingrained in that earlier order that it would fail to seek to make the right decision now about the business judgment rule. And this is very important to Delaware utilities and what they can and cannot recover. It's been bedrock for decades. It should continue to be bedrock, the business judgment rule. So what is the standard for extraordinary expenses? And we have to start, for us to understand this, sort of at the beginning. What is a regulatory standard for evaluating utility decisions? It is a standard for evaluating a decision of a utility's management at the time the decision was made, not backward looking, not second guessing, to determine if the item is recoverable or can be included in rate base. That is foundational, and it will drive the entire analysis, and you'll see it through the entire analysis here. The standard in Delaware is the business judgment rule. The parties agree that there are two primary cases, the Delaware coal case, the Delmarva coal case, excuse me, from the Delaware Supreme Court in 1984, and the Chesapeake case in Superior Court, which we discussed at length last hearing, from 1997. We would respectfully submit that they both support the business judgment rule as being the standard for extraordinary expenses. Now, in the Delmarva coal case, Delmarva signed a contract to buy coal from a company called Avery. Avery failed to meet the contract terms. They delivered coal, but it was defective. It didn't meet the terms of a cleaner coal that was required at the time. Delmarva terminated the contract and decided not to pursue legal remedies against Avery. The price escalation clause in its other contract, which was with a company called Continental, led Delmarva to being forced to pay more for coal than the DPA, then called OPA, thought was appropriate. Delmarva sought to increase its rates under the fuel adjustment clause in its tariffs, and the OPA objected. Here's what happened. First, to set, well, one thing straight, I think staff here has indicated they don't think the case would be relevant to application of the business judgment rule because it involved an interpretation of what was allowed under a specific fuel adjustment clause and the statutes that allowed those back when you had to adjust those fuel numbers back in the 80s when we were trying to deal with clean coal. We would, once again, respectfully suggest that's not true. The applicable statute in the case directed the commission to consider the evidence relevant to a requested change in adjustment in the fuel rider, quote, as it would all evidence in any other rate-making procedure, close quote. And the court wrote in that case, quote, consistency requires that such fuel-related costs be subject to the same standard of review in an FAC adjustment proceeding as in a general rate application proceeding under Section 303A. So that's at page 856. So they really were dealing with the same standard, not something special about fuel adjustment. So we would ask you to set aside staff's attempted distinction of the case as just being about fuel adjustment. So what happened was the Commission Superior Court imposed a prudence standard and found that Delmarva did not act prudently based on the complaints raised by OPA. Now, when you listen to these complaints, I think you'll find them similar to the complaints that have been lodged against the IMU battery replacement. And they were these. Delmarva should have used, quote, more skilled contract negotiators, close quote. Delmarva's agreement to a provision in the contract with Continental that led to price increases should not have happened. They shouldn't have allowed that into the contract when they negotiated it. Also, Delmarva's failures to pursue legal remedies against Avery. Those were the major complaints. Now, like here, those are, of course, after complaints about a contract and how it played out, how it ended up working out. Not about anything specific that would raise any questions about the good faith or rationality of the actions of Delmarva at the time they made those decisions. So the Supreme Court said, of course, fuel adjustment clause statute doesn't change the standard of review, and the standard of review was the business judgment rule. Now, here, although the discussion was not in terms of extraordinary versus ordinary, these expenses, this increase in cost, were much like, and we would say, based on the decision last time, that the IMU labor costs are extraordinary, these would qualify as well. And here's why. They resulted from a non-recurring and unanticipated event, the delivery of defective coal by Avery. What happened here? An unexpected, non-recurring event, the delivery of defective batteries, okay, by SSI. But the Supreme Court ruled that those decisions back at the contract stage couldn't anticipate that, and like all management decisions, they should be evaluated under the business judgment rule. The alleged problems with Delmarva's conduct, like not negotiating with enough skill or agreeing to a provision that worked out badly, weren't enough to overcome, even close to overcome the business judgment rule. And there's been a talk in the briefs, of course, about whether these things are called operating expenses or ordinary operating expenses, et cetera. We submit to you that this commission has used the business judgment rule as its bedrock evaluation standard on rate-based items, and other decisions, including expenses, all types of expenses, for decades. And here's what the Supreme Court said without equivocation in the Delmarva case. The commission was, quote, required to allow legitimate expenses incurred by the utility during the test period. The allowance of such expenses does not call for the exercise of judgment by the commission. Such legitimate expenses are allowed as a matter of course, including any increase in expenditure provided it has not come about by waste or inefficiency. No phraseology about ordinary, extraordinary. These are bedrock principles that this commission should not substitute its business judgment for that of the utility. Also, it said, the legislature's grant to the commission of broad discretionary authority in the ultimate fixing of just and reasonable rates under Section 303A should not be confused with the commission's limited authority to disallow a public utility's incurred operating expenses. Doesn't say extraordinary, doesn't say ordinary, so that's the bedrock. This commission has recognized multiple times in multiple types of situations that it is business judgment. For example, in the Artesian case where Artesian built a new headquarters building years ago, clearly an extraordinary item that was then included, I believe, in rate base. It was judged under the business judgment rule. That's right in the decision, and we've cited that in our papers to the commissioners. So that's the Delmarva, and that set the foundation back in '84. The case that's gotten the most, of course, discussion and lots last time was the 1997 case that involved Chesapeake Utilities. And that case, Chesapeake purchased a property in Dover that it later discovered was contaminated. Excuse me. Chesapeake was required to remediate the contamination under the CERCLA, the Superfund law, and it sought the recovery of its remediation expenses. The commission allowed recovery of the expenses, but denied recovery of any carrying costs, what we probably would now call a return on those expenses. The Superior Court affirmed that decision, and that's where a lot of the debate started in that decision. But what the court decided and what it did, however else you want to try to pull out snippets and say extraordinary, ordinary, operating ordinary, what it did was allow Chesapeake, as the commission did, to recover the remediation expenses, which the court determined were extraordinary expenses. It allowed the recovery of extraordinary expenses as an expense and applied nothing that we can see in that decision other than business judgment. So now it went on, and here's the part where there's the longest discussion. The court went on and denied Chesapeake, affirmed the denial by the commission of any return on those expenses, their carrying cost, because the court did not agree with Chesapeake's argument that those expenses qualified as rate base. And that was the argument made by Chesapeake. There was no other argument made to obtain a return or to recover carrying costs, as it was called, other than these are rate-based expenses. The court looked at it and said, nope, they're not. But remember, the remediation expenses here, these would be the actual, analogously, it would be the labor costs we're trying to recover. Those were allowed, and they were allowed knowing and noting that they were extraordinary in that case. That's what happened. However else we might want to debate the language. So that seems clear to us. That was application of the business judgment rule. If you get into then, do you earn a return on that? And that's the second part, the sort of tail end of our case here, as you know. You could get into whether they should properly be rate-based items or whether this should be an amortized, say, reg asset where you should earn a return on that because you're being fully compensated for early expenditures, for earlier funded expenditures. And that part, the reg asset part, was not part of the Chesapeake case. It was about whether they were rate-based. So we think the application of these cases, in that case, to this situation is relatively straightforward. So, how are extraordinary, and this is what we discovered, there are important differences. to extraordinary expenses. We discovered when we looked very closely at this. But they have to do with the method and timing of recovery, not the standard applied at the time that management makes the decision to incur them. And if you looked at, in our briefs, you saw that we went to other states and we looked and found, and they make sense, that there are reasons that they're different, because you're delaying, the recovery is often delayed. And one question is, did the utility wait too long to try to recover these extraordinary expenses? Did they wait 2 or 3 years and come back and say, well, we had a problem here, we'd like to recover those now? That's a reason. Of course, it's not present here. We were in here within months, a few months of this happening, and these were deferred into a reg asset to give us time to deal with them. So that's not present here. Another situation is if these resulted from, say, an inaccurate projection of cost in the base rate case when we do normalization estimates. There's no indication of that here. They were totally unanticipated, and there's been no indication by anyone saying this was a problem that grew out of some inaccuracy or fault in the base rate case. But those things are there, so there is a reason to look at them differently. I think that's what we were dealing with last time. But it's not, as we found ourselves, and we looked closely, that it's not a difference in the standard to evaluate the conduct. So what is it that is offered to you by DPA and staff for a standard other than business judgment? So first I talk about what DPA offers. They argue that only rate-based items can be recovered as extraordinary expenses. From page 12 of their brief, quote, DPA respectfully requests the Commission to find, because these are extraordinary expenses and because they do not fit into the statutory categories of rate base, they will be disallowed. If you agree with that, there will be no more extraordinary expenses allowed in this state unless they're also rate base. That's not workable. There's all kinds of expenses. There could be storm expenses, changes in law like happened with CERCLA, a large litigation, a natural disaster, a cyber attack, you name it. And they're going to be expenses, and they're going to be unanticipated. They're going to be non-recurring. And if you adopt the position that you only can recover them if they're rate-based items, those will be unrecoverable. That certainly is unfair and will hurt utilities in this state. So we would say that standard offered by DPA is very easily seen as unworkable and contrary to law, and also, by the way, conflicts with the Chesapeake case where those extraordinary expenses were allowed. As the hearing examiner points out, a system where only rate base can be recovered as extraordinary expenses just doesn't make sense, and he talks about that in his report. And these types of extraordinary expenses have come up in the past. I had Delmarva look, and there was an audit management fee in docket 09417 and tax-related billing error of over $3 million in docket 11-528. And I didn't cite those in our briefs. I'm not trying to say that's substantive evidence, but those are examples, and you can think of lots of hypotheticals where you're going to have extraordinary expenses and they should be recovered. They won't be unless they're rate-based if you follow the recommendation of DPA. DPA also argues, and their other argument we see there is that we are actually seeking here rate-based treatment by the way we want these treated, and therefore they should be judged as rate-based. So, well, that's not what we're doing, of course. We're just looking for allowance of a expense out of a reg asset. We're not going to depreciate them. They're not going to continue to earn a return in the future as a useful asset. They're going to be recovered, and then that's it. They'll be paid off, and that's it. So we're not treating them as rate base and never have said they're rate base. Staff's argument on standard, if you look at their exceptions. Staff does not propose to our discernment any concrete standard for reviewing decisions to incur the IMU labor replacement cost or in general for extraordinary costs. Staff points out that in the Chesapeake decision, Judge Quillen confirmed, and quote, utilities are not guaranteed that all extraordinary expenses or all operating expenses can be recovered. Well, of course that's true. Not all expenses would necessarily meet the business judgment rule, or extraordinary expenses could be excluded for some of the other reasons I talked about. You come in too late, they're really not extraordinary. So that's not really news and shouldn't drive the analysis here. Staff ultimately argues that the commission can decide whether to allow recovery of extraordinary expenses, quote, this is page 6, in its discretion. Of course, we would submit this is effectively no standard at all. Provides no guidance on which extraordinary expenses should be allowed and which should not be allowed, just for the commission to decide. Does not address how to evaluate, remember I said this was important, decisions at the time they were made. That's the way management, that's the way the law can be predictable for utility management. So they know when they make a decision what standard will be applied to that decision. Staff also makes an argument on executive compensation, saying there are other expenses which the commission has disallowed for reasons other than not meeting the business judgment rule, for different reasons, for the SERP and executive compensation they cite, for high-level executives. We would, of course, submit there. That's not analogous. Those are excluded for a completely separate reason, as staff puts in their brief. They're not necessary to achieve safety, reliability, or customer goals. That's clearly not true here. Delmarva can't run a gas delivery business without meter readings through its IMU system. It's nothing like the Policy Choice Commission has said, if you're going to do that for your high-level executives, you're doing that for your high-level executives. You don't really need that to recruit the talent you need to run a safe and reliable system. This is much more core and fundamental. So it's a different reason those are excluded. So, if you would decide in favor of staff and DP on this, Delaware will be by itself when it comes to state regulators and how they approach extraordinary expenses. So when grappling with these questions, we looked at neighboring states. We found they apply the same standard to ordinary and extraordinary expenses. Staff and DPA have not contested our research and our citations on that. Maryland has expressly rejected the argument that a different standard applies to ordinary and extraordinary expenses. See page 12 of our brief for the case citation. Basically, they said, and this is a direct quote, but it's close, we cannot think of a legally justifiable basis other than a utility violating Maryland's normal prudence standard for denying extraordinary expenses. You deny, and they use prudence instead of business judgment. So when confronted with the law of neighboring states, and we also cited you the law from Pennsylvania, staff and DPA have been unable to cite even a single case in any jurisdiction where the utility regulators apply a different standard to ordinary and extraordinary expenses. So if Delaware decides to step out on this and adopt this standard, or whatever it is the result, because I'm not sure what the standard is, that staff and DPA are asking you to do, you will be by yourself as far as we know. And you'll certainly be different than neighboring states. And you'll certainly cause these problems about not knowing what to do with extraordinary expenses. So the other thing that staff and DPA do, although it's hard to determine exactly how they want this to fit into your decision today, they do take shots, again, at the conduct of Delmarva. They don't expressly make it an argument against the business judgment rule, but they say a number of things. First of which, and I'm almost done, first of which is that the hearing examiner relied on too much hearsay evidence to find the conduct, to determine what the conduct was, and it met the business judgment rule. That's right in the brief. So first, staff and DPA waived that objection because it was not raised at the evidentiary hearing. You will search the transcript in vain for a hearsay objection. The witness they complained gave the hearsay testimony, Ms. Lefkowitz, was not there for the negotiation, as they say, but actually knew the terms of the contract, put those in the record, and that's the starting point for a business judgment analysis. Was it an arm's length contract that's rational? That's what was there. We also had other witnesses, Mr. Zeminski and Kalachi, who also gave direct testimony about those things. The commission's not bound by technical rules of evidence. And in fact, some of the hearsay questions, if you look at the hearing transcript at page 107, were actually asked by DPA's counsel concerning, for example, who made the decision to purchase the IMUs from Silver Spring. So we don't think that should be a consideration. Their gripes, and I'll do these quickly because I think you've heard them before, did not negotiate a large enough liquidated damages provision. Well, that's based, of course, completely on hindsight. There's no evidence that management at the time did not exercise good faith judgment when negotiating that provision. A higher limit would have cost more. There are no red flags about the technology or batteries. It was new, but there's nothing to indicate they didn't evaluate the situation to the best of their business judgment at the time and agree to a provision they thought was a balance between what the liquidated provision, damage provision they got and what they were going to have to pay. Second complaint, Delmarva took possession, and these are all at the DPA brief at page 12, took possession of all batteries at once, so the warranty expired at the same time on all batteries. Again, completely backward looking, doesn't speak at all to the good faith and rationality of the decision at the time. Of course, it certainly could have been, probably was efficient to deliver them all at the same time. Multiple deliveries would have cost more. There's no red flag there at the time. And the batteries were expected to last, as the commission noted last time, 15 to 20 years. So there was no reason to worry about getting them installments so the warranty wouldn't run. Third, Delmarva did not pay enough attention to the batteries because of other problems. That's obviously second guessing. Delmarva originally thought the failures were, and quote, this is from the testimony, part of normal deployment growth or related to installation procedure issues. So there were other things. They were looking at any number of things, and they were thinking about it. They thought, why are these things going bad? They discovered the disturbing increase in the failures after SSI had fully paid the $5 million. So nothing there that would constitute bad faith or the not caring kind of attitude that would require to disqualify this. Lastly, we hear that Delmarva could not convince SSI to cover all the replacement costs when they had to negotiate the settlement. Well, actually, it was a very good settlement in light of the fact SSI had already paid its full liquidated damages, and the warranty on the batteries had expired. Delmarva nevertheless obtained their agreement to supply new batteries, 140,000 of them, valued at nearly $2 million, and reimbursed over $150,000 of replacement costs. No hint of bad faith or lack of care there. So without second guessing, and that's basically it, I should address, since it's been brought up multiple times, the defective car part analogy, which you've heard and seen multiple times, which is, gee, there's this defective car part, and the ratepayers shouldn't have to bear that because it's sort of paying twice for the same thing. Well, the analogy's probably not bad, but it's misapplied. When you buy a car, you get a warranty, just like on parts, just like Delmarva got from SSI. Now, you get it, it's limited. It's usually, 3 years bumper to bumper or whatever, and you pay that as part of the price of the car. If you want more, a longer warranty, you pay more. And if you've bought a car lately, they bring you in, they try to sell you, up to 100,000 or whatever, but you pay more. So here, there was a business judgment how much to pay and for the length of the warranty. That was made and done, and could they have gotten a longer warranty? Maybe if they thought it was necessary, but what they did, of course, was what you do when you buy a car. You decide, I got to balance how much more I got to get paid for a longer warranty versus, whether I think I'll need that warranty. They did that. There's no evidence they did that in any way other than in good faith. So that actually, we would say, is instructive here if you look at it the right way. So that's it. It should be business judgment. This conduct fit that. Last question is the return on the regulatory asset. And that is, the hearing examiner ruled against us, and we can see that result based on what he saw in Chesapeake. We would say this is different for the following reasons, and clearly it's not the lead issue here because it probably won't establish a standard, but it is important. We say that Delmarva should earn a return on this regulatory asset. It is a RAG asset. It's not a rate-based item. The parties here agreed, and the commission ordered to delay any recovery by placing these expenses into a regulatory asset until the parties and commission could address them in a full deliberative process. If the commission allows recovery of the labor costs as a legitimate expense, it's that delay that Delmarva should be compensated for, like is fairly typical with reg assets. It is compensation for it not receiving the money when it expended it, or even during the rate case, but at a later time. It's that return we would seek. This is not like Chesapeake, where the only argument presented for earning a return was that the costs were rate-based items. It should go on rate base and earn a return in that way. So we would see this as different in a more typical case of just allowing a recovery out of a regulatory asset, and in that situation, it's right to compensate the utility for the delay in the use of that money. It didn't get it at the time it should have at the expenditure. So we would see this as more straightforward and different, and therefore a reason to provide us a return on that at this time. So I know that's been a while. We see this as very important. That's why we've continued to litigate it. I appreciate very much your attention to this rather long presentation, but we would encourage the commission to think very hard and long about this and not step out of line with other commissions and past precedent here into an area where you will deny an extraordinary expense without adopting a clear and rational standard that will provide utilities guidance going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Geddes.
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair. Ms. Arori has requested if she could go first, at least for a limited basis.
Thank you, Madam Acting Chair and Commissioners. And it is a very limited basis because since staff's and DPA's arguments are pretty much similar, Mr. Gaddis is going to handle most of it, and so that you're not subject to hearing it from me too. However, there are a few points that Delmarva made that the DPA must respond to because they were only referenced to the DPA. The first point I would make is what you just heard is a motion for re-argument without a motion for re-argument having been made. The commission decided in May, in its order 9399, that the business judgment rule did not apply. And what you have just heard is a motion for re-argument as to why it should. Delmarva's counsel referred repeatedly to page 12 of the DPA's brief as if that was the only page in our brief. We do have several more pages, but let me read to you what Delmarva's counsel did not tell you. What we said was, we did not argue that Chesapeake stands for the proposition that extraordinary expenses cannot be recovered. What we did argue is that when the facts of Chesapeake are compared to the facts in this case, it is obvious that the commission's decision to apportion responsibility for the extraordinary remediation costs between Chesapeake's shareholders and ratepayers was fair and equitable, and it is equally obvious that it would be unfair and inequitable for Delmarva's ratepayers to pay any of the extraordinary incremental labor costs for installing the replacement IMU batteries. And then we went on to explain why. Delmarva disagrees with that, and we understand that they disagree with that. However, it is inaccurate to say, as Delmarva says, and as the hearing examiner says, that we say that Chesapeake stands for the proposition that extraordinary expenses can never be recovered. That is simply not the case. Speaking of extraordinary expenses, Delmarva argues that if you agree with the DPA and staff in this case, extraordinary expenses will never be able to be recovered. Again, that is inaccurate. Chesapeake is a perfect example of that. You allowed the remediation costs to be recovered under, exercising your discretion under Section 103G, and you denied a return. I would also point out that storm damage expenses are normally classified as an extraordinary expense, yet this commission routinely grants recovery of such expenses. Rather, what I would suggest to you is that you accept Delmarva's argument and the hearing examiner's argument in this case. The commission will never be allowed to disallow any expenses because everything will be Delmarva's business judgment. think our last argument would be that, and I think Mr. Geddes will go into this more, but I would simply point out to you that other states use the prudence standard as the standard that applies to both ordinary and extraordinary. As this commission knows, Delaware does not have a prudence standard. Therefore, what other states do is an opposite. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Mr. Geddes.
Thank you, Ms. Hart. With your permission, I'd like to hand out your order of May, the Chesapeake decision, and a portion of your decision in 13115, which was the last fully litigated case in Delaware. I'm sort of reminded of the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, because I think we've been here before. It may not be February, but I believe most of what you've heard so far, you heard in April. You specifically, in the order 9399, which Ms. Iori referred to, paragraph 4, have already made a determination, which I believe, and I believe Ms. Iori believes, has already decided that these costs should not and cannot be recovered because they are not necessary for the efficient operation of the utility. So let's delve into that a little bit more. All the materials that you have received since issuing your order are irrelevant. They have no bearing on the issue before you. The only issue that went back to the hearing examiner at the urging of the chair to see if there could be a resolution of this matter between the parties, or perhaps refine the development of in his mind, the appropriate standard. And the hearing examiner chose not to follow that direction, clear direction, in that order. And rather than coming back to you and saying, look, 1, I cannot follow what you've asked me to do, or 2, there is no standard, or some other iteration, he merely went back to the business judgment rule. That's not what you asked him to do. And that hearing examiner's report, I would contend, has no merit and should not be relied on. That's why I say, like the movie, we're back to where we were in April. You had the same materials before you as to the application of the business judgment to this particular category of expense. You had the arguments from staff and the DPA as to why Chesapeake was applicable. And we are going to urge you again to consider exactly what you decided then, which was these are extraordinary expenses and they are not necessary for the efficient operation of the utility. Having made that decision, that's the end of it. Nothing else has to be decided. Now, there was no motion for re-argument. The company is not here before you today saying that your decision on these labor costs as being extraordinary was wrong. They're just saying that the standard by which you should apply the review is a business judgment rule. And let me show you why that's wrong. First of all, there's been no discussion about what the rate-based statutes in Maryland and other states look like. There's been some suggestion that somehow that prudency and the fact that they are based on prudency is not relevant. I will tell you, having lived through the Cole case, 1985, 86, and before, I know all about the application of the prudency standard and Justice Horsey's decision saying, where is it in the statute And so I'll flip that argument around. Where is it in the statute that says extraordinary expenses are subject to the business judgment rule? It is not. It does not exist. As you all know, I cannot draw, but sometimes pictures are worth 1,000 words. And so maybe I'll save a few. These are supposed to be boxes. Okay, so what do we have? We have rate base, operating expenses, and extraordinary expenses. They are not the same. Judge Quillen, Justice Quillen, Banker Quillen, somebody that everybody knows and believes was a very fine jurist, said specifically in Chesapeake, which is, and I'll give you a reference when I sit down, these two are not equal. These are different. This cannot be that. And if it was that, then you wouldn't have this box. It's an extraordinary expense. What's the case law that relates to this? Rate base is Diamond State, 1983 case. Oops. Judge Quillen's decision basically says that if it's a rate-based item, it's mandated for recovery. That's what the inside wiring, and I wasn't, fortunately, not involved in Diamond State, but the inside wiring was a big issue when Judge Green deregulated in early 80s. And the other decision, which I do know something about, is the Cole case. Now, the Cole case involved Section 303, and we all know fuel costs were going high. We all know about the negotiations. I know more about Roger Campbell than anybody. In any event, the issue is, it was an operating expense. It wasn't an extraordinary expense. The cost elevated in an extraordinary way because the Delmarva representative thought the market was the cap, and unfortunately the market took off, and the West Virginians pocketed the money. But it was an operating expense. No one ever said it was an extraordinary expense except the size of it. The OPA sued for $10 million, I think, or $5 million. But it was a big number back then. This was never at issue. Now, as Quillen says, Judge Quillen, sorry, in order to get here, you cannot get this way. You cannot go home, ET. You got to go this way. You got to go. If you're going to get recovery of an extraordinary, something that has been classified as an extraordinary expense, which it has been in this case, that's decided law. Not decided law, but decided commission precedent. You have made that determination. There's been no effort to try to undo that. The only issue before you is what's the appropriate standard. And how do you get here? How do you get this to here? The idea that it's an extraordinary expense and if staff's position and the OPA's position is correct, they'll never get recovery. There's an old Bill Bailey term, but I guess I can't use it. It's not true. The way you get here, one, it's rate base, or B, subsection 1023G, that gives you, the commission, the discretion to include it in rate base if you think it's necessary for the efficient operation of the utility. That's how, cyber problems, remediation problems, things that the company does not expect, get recovery. They argue you should use your discretion and put it in this box and allow us a return for it. That's how you get the money. You don't get it through here, you get it through here. And the reason there isn't a standard, because not all decisions are the same. The business judgment rule does not apply to this, it applies to that, and to this. It has no application down here, and you cannot find a case in Delaware that says that. And in fact, if you look at your decision, in the last litigated Delmarva case, 13115, paragraph 139, which is at the end, which I've highlighted, you specifically said, with respect to non-executive compensation, And in fact, the hearing examiner agreed, because he disallowed the adjustment, that if it's not required for the operation of the utility, i.e. subparagraph G here, and it's an extraordinary expense, you can disallow it. And that is decisional law, precedent here in front of the commission that has not been reversed by a court. As Justice Quillen said in his decision in Chesapeake, in order for this to go into there has to be a finding by this commission, a finding by this commission that it's necessary for the efficient operation of the utility. There is no such finding here. And in fact, it's just the opposite. You found in April and in a written decision in May that it wasn't necessary. Therefore, it doesn't get this. Therefore, it should be disallowed. Because if you look at paragraph 139, dealing with non-executive compensation, you specifically said extraordinary expense, same as the IMU labor cost, and it's not necessary for the operation of the utility, the efficient operation. And so therefore it didn't come in. It got disallowed. And it's still the most recent decision by this commission on this issue. So the argument that the business judgment rule, waste, use of discretion, etc., applies to this is just wrong. It's just wrong. There's nothing that says that. Certainly Judge Quillen's decision says in paragraph 11, which I believe is 13 in your copy, he said, on the other hand, there is no Delaware law that requires all extraordinary expenses to be recovered. That's just the opposite of, if it's a rate-based item, A through F, you've got to allow the company to recover it, because that's invested capital for public service. Why wouldn't you? I mean, if it's rate-based and all that, there are some exceptions, known and measurable foreseeability, but if it's there on the books, you've got to basically allow them to recover a return on it. And it's the same here. That is the business judgment. This is the case that established that application to operating expenses. But they never talked about this because it wasn't operating expenses, it's fuel. So I think, with all due respect to my learned colleague, the conflation of these two things is inappropriate. They can't get the business judgment this way. The only way they get the business judgment is this way. And they haven't gone through this gate. Because G says you can make the decision that it's not this. And you did. And you already have. So there's really nothing to decide here. You gave the company and the parties and the hearing examiner an opportunity. I would suggest we failed. We didn't take the opportunity for whatever reason. In the sense of, we're presenting you the same thing we presented to you in April. There is no standard. It's your discretion. You can do whatever you want within reason, of course. And there's been no establishment on this record that this was necessary. The company did not put in one scintilla of evidence that these labor costs were necessary for the operation of the utility. And two, your precedent says, if I find an extraordinary expense is not necessary for the operation of the utility, I can disallow it. And you did, and you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would I get a short reply, Chairperson? Or-
Can you keep it to 5 minutes?
Actually, I do have two other issues to hit very quickly.
Okay.
That were DPA's issues, not staff's issues. The first is, as Delmarva alluded to earlier, we did take issue with the hearing examiner going outside the record to find as a fact that staff and the DPA did not object to the commission approving the implementation of AMI. We are not sure why that is even relevant, but the fact of the matter is, he did go outside the record. He has done it before. And it is inappropriate. And all we wanted to do was bring it to the attention of the commission. And, we do ask that the commission ask its hearing examiners to not go outside. They are not investigators. They are presented with facts that the parties believe support their cases, and that's it. Secondly, the hearsay contentions that we have made only apply if you should find that the business judgment rule standard applies for the reasons given by Mr. Geddes. We do not believe that the business judgment rule should apply, but in any event, that argument is irrelevant if the commission finds that the extraordinary expenses should not be recovered because of, or exercise its discretion to find that they should not be recovered. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
5 minutes, and I'll be glad to keep to that because I just want to
Thank
point out a couple things that I heard that I think the commission should keep in mind. So what I heard from between staff and DPA as far as what you should use to apply, and I wrote these down, hope I got them right. Ms. Iori said fair and whether it's fair and equitable or unfair and inequitable. Said it twice. Mr. Geddes said necessary for efficient operation of the utility. And at the end, he said, there is no standard. And that's where you'll be left. Because the Section 103G exception is in the rate base section. It's one subsection, a catch-all for rate base type items. To expand that to say that this commission can do whatever it wants on any type of extraordinary expense, and there is no way for an operating expense to be an extraordinary expense, is simply trying to stretch the only thing they could find, which is not in their brief, raised here today, to try to stretch and actually say we've got a standard. And it doesn't work. Once again, in Chesapeake, they allowed those. There's no mention of 103 with respect to the actual remediation expenses. They were allowed, and they are business judgment. If you do this, you will be telling the regulated community, if you have extraordinary expenses, we can, under 103, the only way you can get them back is if the rate base, or if we decide any way we want to, that it's necessary and essential, that's the only way you can get them back. Now, if you can go to other states, and that remains uncontested, by the way, that other states don't do it this way. They apply the same standard. It's prudence, right? Ordinary, extraordinary, or whatever it is. Every state, it's uncontested. You'll make the dichotomy. The only state to make the difference between the two, when management looks at making a decision, it can't say, is this reasonable business judgment in extraordinary circumstances? They have to say, can I get this back because it's necessary and efficient on whatever grounds the decision that the commission later decides in its discretion. There is no standard, quote unquote, Jim Geddes. Okay? So that's why you need to do this. And there's no reason, it doesn't make sense for there to be those different standards. And 103G relates to, it's a catch-all for other rate-based type items, not expenditures. It's not the way it's been done in the past with reg assets. It would not be a prudent way to go forward in the future. And I think that's under 5, and I thank you for your attention.
Just a point of clarification, I would take exception with Mr. Skaggs.
Did he ask for permission to do this?
I did.
It's always a point of clarification.
Well, it is because.
Okay, I'll wait. I'll see if I have one when he's done. Thanks.
I believe the Chesapeake case only dealt with carrying costs and did not deal with the issue of the segmentation of the cost in the rider. The only issue that went up on appeal, because Chesapeake didn't appeal the first part, they only appealed the fact that the commission had denied carrying costs on that reg asset. Thank you.
Commissioners, do you have any questions of anybody, please?
I think I understand the arguments presented by both sides, and this is a tough case for me because while I don't want to handicap the financial performance of the utility and reduce potential to get favorable access to capital in the open market, I also don't want to burden the ratepayers for decisions which are exclusively made by Delmarva yet may accrue some significant and extraordinary costs for the public. I do have one concern and one question. Does this commission have the authority and the flexibilities to simply say yes or no to the hearing examiner's report and the amount of $3.45 million up or down? Or do we have the discretion and flexibilities to, for example, apportion part fulfillment of the utilities request by, for example, deploying half of that outstanding balance to the ratepayer and half of it to the utility? Can someone help me with that? Do we have the discretion?
Mr. O'Brien is your counsel.
Mr. O'Brien?
Thank you, Chairman Gray, and if the other lawyers want to chime in, I
Sorry.
suppose that they will ask.
Sorry.
I mean,
Commissioner
Gray.
Thank you.
Field promotion.
Point of clarification.
Madam Acting Chair, Commissioners, Bill O'Brien, as you know, I'm Commission Counsel on this case. So the easy question is, do you have the authority to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on the hearing examiner's report? Yes, you can give a thumbs up to the hearing examiner's report, and that could be the end of the story. If you give a thumbs down to the hearing examiner's report, then you still need to provide a decision on the disputed issue, which is the $3.4 million. And then you also asked if you could split the baby. Once you decide what legal standard you're going to use for this extraordinary expense, you would be hard-pressed to be able to legally defend splitting the $3.4 million. If you choose to share the risk of this type of expense between ratepayers and shareholders, which is done pretty commonly, that is the case under Chesapeake, where you allow the underlying expense and disallow the carrying cost. And there's analysis around both of those questions, but that's one way that commission split the baby on an extraordinary expense. But the $3.4 million, as your legal counsel, I'd say it would be tough to go in between 0 and 3.4 on that.
Okay, I think I understand that answer. I do have one concern, listening and with the prospects of a decision pending on the table. I'm concerned about discouraging Delmarva to adopt new technologies that present risks and perhaps extraordinary costs. Not only safety risks, technology risks, financial risks, but from my time on the commission, technology has moved pretty quickly. And I don't want, on the one hand, to say, or send a signal with a decision here that we want to discourage risk because it may accrue a financial extraordinary cost, and now we have to have a debate about who's going to pay for it. But on the other hand, I don't think the absence of these replacement batteries would have caused utility operations to stop. So I don't see it as critical for the efficient operation of the utilities. The way I read the evidence, perhaps there would need to be manual deployment of meter readers, but it wouldn't have caused utility operations to stop. And in one of the cases where it was disclosed that there was a higher cost of coal, generation is critical to the efficient operation of the utility. So I see a distinction and a difference between the case used. I'll yield to my other commissioners at this point if they want to have comment.
Could I address that comment in 30 seconds?
No, it's up to the chair.
It's up to the chair.
Go ahead.
I don't believe it certainly would have, it is necessary and efficient. It is the way the meters are read now. The whole manual meter reading kind of infrastructure, wouldn't be there. So would it stop it forever? No. Would it be a major disruption? I think yes. I mean, these batteries, you have to have them. It's the way the meters are read now. The other possibility here, by the way, on the splitting the baby question was necessary and essential, and that's what you were asking about. Yeah, these batteries, you don't get batteries, you don't read the meters, you don't have a gas distribution business, so even under their own catch-all. I just don't want to get remanded again to the hearing officer to say, were these necessary and essential? Because in our view they were, but thank you.
Madam Acting Chair, may I respond to that briefly? Thank you. There are customers now that don't have IMUs, and their meters are being read. So to say that they are necessary and essential to provide service, I don't think is entirely accurate. You could remove all of the IMUs, and the meters would still need to be read, and would still be read.
Commissioner Drexler?
Understanding that we're reopening the question about the business judgment rule here, and that we had already agreed it was not subject to that. However, I think there have been some new points that have been raised that I don't know whether they would have changed our decision back in April, but the fact of the matter is that no one is disputing the fact that Delmarva did not act in bad faith. It was not committing waste. It was not committing abuse. So that takes us into, should it be ruled as did we mistakenly remove this from being determined under the business judgment rule? I don't know. But is it necessary for we're talking a lot about, is it necessary for the essential and efficient operation of the utility? We're arguing here a lot about whether taking all the IMUs out of service would then, force the company to then send out meter readers. Well, where are those meter readers? I mean, these are people who, maybe the guy or the woman who used to come to our house, there aren't any meter readers. You couldn't just say, as Delmarva, okay, now we're going to send people out. Who are you going to send out? There aren't any meter readers, except for the people who currently read some of the meters.
Your Honor, that's actually inaccurate. They still do have to go out and read the meters. They don't have to physically walk up to the meter and look at it anymore. What they do is they drive by and they point
Right.
something at it. So they still have meter readers.
But they're reading the IM,
They're reading the meter.
Yeah,
They're reading the IMUs,
Yeah.
yes, but
But if
they
you-
still have to go out.
Right, but I'm just saying that as a practical matter, to send people out, then you have to go from house to house. That's gonna, I think you need more people
They
than
still
just.
have to go house to house.
Yeah, I just
But
checked
you,
with.
like, if I'm driving by, it's easier than,
Yes.
you know.
They can
Those people
cover.
still work there. They did not lay anybody off as a result of the gas IMUs going into use. Those people were perhaps assigned to other,
Right.
assigned to other functions, but they didn't lay anybody off. So ratepayers were still paying the labor costs for those employees.
I would try to just clear this up, because I just looked at,
Yeah.
yeah, they were, there are meter readers, but as common sense would indicate, much fewer, they're just walking by, taking the radio, they were reassigned. So that group of people, the mass of people that are out doing it, that's the way we got efficiency from this, that's sort of undisputed, so that's the bottom line.
So I'll circle back. So there were points raised here, but then again, I have to go back to, we had already determined this was not going to be subject to the business judgment rule because of, we saw it on the diagram Mr. has put up. So, I mean, we're in a hard place here to determine whether we then say, well, we determined it was this before, now we're gonna go back and say, well, the hearing examiner's raising some good points. Maybe we were wrong, maybe we did it wrong, but, like, are we reopening this for re-argument today? And is that appropriate? I don't
May I,
think so.
may I comment?
Yes.
First of all, in all my years in front of the commission, normally, once you start deliberations, council only respond to specific questions. Second, I believe with regard to this, as Mr. Orient and I have both said, this is, in many ways, looks like re-argument, and the decision that you've already made is in front of you, which does limit your consideration of standards, any standard, but the business judgment rule, because that's what you ordered before, and you said it was an extraordinary expense. So you either come up with a different standard, or you ask for further clarification. But I would remind you that two of the individuals who made that collective decision with you in May are not here today. And I think it would be very unusual if if in some way a decision you made today negated or otherwise abrogated their signatures on an order, a written order that the commission has issued saying that this is an extraordinary expense not necessary for the operation of the utility. Thank you.
Mr. O'Brien? What options do we have at this point, please? Your ball.
First off, I understand what Mr. Geddes is saying. This is a very important case, and we do just have 3 sitting commissioners. But the law on that is we do have a quorum, so you can make a decision as long as you get a 3-0 vote, an affirmative 3-0 vote. That's not to say whether you want to use your discretion for other reasons to put this off. That would be fine too. But the question as to whether you can make a decision today that is contrary to your last order, you're not bound by commission precedent. If you have a new reason, if you can explain your reasoning for going against commission precedent, then that, and it's a rational basis, then that would likely be upheld by the courts. Now, this is a little unusual because it's not just commission precedent, it's an order that was in this case, and it was just a few months ago. But if you have a different opinion now, it doesn't seem sensible that you would feel shackled by your earlier decision when it was a commission decision and you are the commission. So you can make a new decision today if you have a rational basis for changing your opinion on the matter.
Thank you.
Madam Acting Chair, may I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a slightly different opinion on that, as I'm sure you can imagine. I would generally agree with my colleague that commission can choose to go against its precedent. I don't think it can go against an order that it entered in the same case without a motion for re-argument, which no party submitted. The time to submit such a motion under the commission's rules long expired. But that is basically what you would be doing. You would be granting a motion for re-argument that no party asked for, and this isn't a threat, but we would appeal that.
Commissioner Gray.
Madam Chair, so if I use the foundation of our Order 9399, 21st of May, 2019, in this matter, on page 3, and read, therefore, the recovery of those expenses by the utility should be reviewed under a different standard than the business judgment rule, and the hearing examiner should recommend the appropriate standard by which we should judge potential recoverability of these costs. If I stand on that foundation as I read the hearing examiner's report that I've received and reviewed, I do not believe the hearing examiner has fulfilled the order accordingly. And while I would like to have the discretion as a commission to split the baby in some ways, because I don't want to incentivize the utility to continue making decisions that may accrue extraordinary financial burden on ratepayers, I can't do that according to my counsel. And since this has not been presented based on a different standard by the hearing examiner, I'm prepared to make a motion.
And that motion would be?
My motion is that the commission reject the request for reimbursement of labor expenses. And the basis of that is simply that the order of 9399 from the 22nd of May has not been fulfilled.
Commissioner Drexler, do you want to second that motion or let it die?
I do not want to second that motion.
All right, so
The chair can move it. The chair can second guess it.
what do you want us?
Well, there are 2 commissioners that can second the motion. We know that one is not.
Yes,
If there's no second, then the motion fails.
okay, motion fails. now?
Is there another motion?
Is there another motion?
Commissioner Drexler, do you have a motion?
I'm wondering if, my question is whether we can remand this back to the hearing examiner, who may have misunderstood what we were asking. And what we were asking was to use another standard, and he did not use another standard, he uses the business judgment rule. But I think it's important enough to remand it back to him and say, this did not satisfy our request. And if there's additional information, let's use that. If there's another standard to use. I agree with Commissioner Gray that we don't want to discourage technology and advancements by our utilities. And I don't know whether denying the recoverability of these costs that were not done in bad faith or in an abusive way is appropriate. So I don't think it should die here. I think we should remand to the hearing examiner to specifically determine whether is another aspect of this that we don't see.
Madam Acting Chair, may I be heard?
Do we have a second to that motion first, please?
I'll look again to my counsel. Is this an appropriate measure for us to put on the table and decide on?
You can certainly decide on a second remand. It is a legal issue, the standard, so I would not be confident that something different would come out of it. So there's nothing stopping you from remanding it again. I think it would be helpful to provide the reasoning for the remand. If it is simply take another look at what the legal standard is, I fear we're not gonna move the ball forward. But that's my opinion.
Go ahead.
Could I suggest something else? And I'd ask Mr. O'Brien to comment on this. But as a participant, I would like to get a judgment that everyone is happy with, and maybe that's impossible. But one other option would be, I think you could make a motion to table this and to have it heard in January when more members of the commission are available, rather than remanding it to the hearing examiner to perhaps come back with the same result or some other result, and we're in the same spot in a couple months. We may be able to move the matter forward by merely just tabling it with a motion and having more members of the commission consider it at a later date. Thank you.
And since Mr. Geddes spoke up, we would say then it could very well be appropriate, in light of the difficulties here in assessing the standard and the decision of the hearing examiner to go back to that standard, we think for compelling reasons, to allow a motion for re-argument if that's really the way we're going to construe this, as opposed to on a hearing examiner's report, perhaps even out of the time period because of the way this developed, and then we could do that at a later time. You wouldn't have to decide that right now, but we may go that route and then be able to put it before the commission on all grounds, before all commissioners. But I just want to put that on the record, not that that's something I'm asking the commission to decide.
Madam Acting Chair, before you make any motions, I'm looking at Mr. O'Brien. What Mr. Geddes said, and I think you, sir, you said all commissioners. I just want to point out, we will not have 5 commissioners till February.
Yeah.
Chairman has said that he's not available in January, so just letting you know, if there's a postponement and you want all 5 commissioners, then it has to be in February. Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, do you have any thoughts?
I would like to table this till February.
I will second that motion.
Amendment to that motion, when we can assure that 5 commissioners will be presiding.
Okay. All right,
So moved.
second?
Aye.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you all. Thank you.
Appreciate your patience today.
Thank you, Commissioners. The next item on the agenda is public comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to make comment?
They don't need to decide whether
There being none, we'll go to director's comments.
Thank you, Madam Commissioners, Madam Chair and Commissioners. We're getting confused here today, sorry. 2 quick comments. Last week, you had approved the calendar for next year, for 2020. Just one minor change due to one staff request. The December 9th meeting should be December 2nd. And then the only other announcement is, well, I have 2 other announcements. One is, next commission meeting is on January 8th, 2020, when we'll have 2020 vision. And I'd like to belated congratulations to Commissioner Drexler for being the Commission's representative on macro.
Thank you.
And a new congratulations to Commissioner Gray for being the representative to OPSI starting January 1st, 2020. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, before you adjourn the meeting, I'd just like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year. Enjoy your holidays.
Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you, and happy holidays to